Welcome to this webinar. We're very glad you have joined us today. We have engaged in a very exciting process to develop indicators, standards for measuring whether people with disabilities are in fact achieving their goals. There are other standards for measuring goals. There are other standards for measuring the work of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. There are other indicators. But what is unique about our standards is that they reflect the voices of people with disabilities. My name is Marcia Ryu, and I'm the co-director of DRPI and a distinguished research professor at York University in Toronto, Canada. I am here this morning with Jose Vieira, who was the Latin American Regional Coordinator for DRPI and is also the Human Rights Policy Advisor at the World Blind Union. Excuse me. We're very glad you have joined us for this webinar. The work of DRPI has been to monitor or track the rights of people with disabilities locally and globally. To do this, we monitor three areas: systemic issues, that is laws, policies, programs, and services. Secondly, public attitudes, that is social attitudes and opinions we find in the media. And finally, we monitor individual experiences of people with disabilities themselves in their own communities. Several years ago, we were asked by the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities to look at our data from individual experiences monitoring and to develop indicators which could be used by the committee in understanding progressive realization of countries towards the goals of the CRPD as they move from one review to the next. We are very pleased to be able to provide our report on that work and to present a brief overview of the People's Indicators. They are the People's Indicators because they reflect the voice of people with disabilities themselves. They are the heart of citizenship participation. CART is being used during this webinar, and an accessible version of the PowerPoint presentation can be found for download in the handouts section of the webinar platform, as well as on the DRPI website. At the end of this presentation, there will be an option to ask questions. You can do this by using the question box on your screen, or you can email the questions to drpi.questions@gmail.com. An accessible version of the PowerPoint is available in the handouts section of the webinar. The PowerPoint presentation, webinar video, and transcript will be available at the end of the webinar on the DRPI website. What do our indicators do? Our indicators achieve two goals. One, they provide a concrete way to evaluate progressive realization. And two, they provide a way to develop concrete questions for the committee and those writing shadow reports, questions to ask government, service providers, and others how well they are moving and how quickly they are moving along the road to the entrenchment of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. During this webinar, we will, then you have on your screen an agenda. We'll look at where we're at 10 years later. We'll look at some of the general principles. We'll discuss the ideas around progressive realization, why we've developed People's Indicators, the intersections, what People's Indicators provide, some examples of the actual indicators so that you can follow through as you follow the paper, and then concluding remarks. We look forward to you participating with us in the next hour. Jose?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Marcia, for letting me participating in this webinar. And as you said, I think that the most important characteristic of the paper that we are presenting today is the fact that our indicators are coming from persons with disabilities. I would say that there are three main principles that have guided the construction of our report. The first principle is that you cannot build indicators without understanding, for instance, what do people or what do persons with disability understand by disadvantages. It is crucial to understand that as long as we do not consider the voice of persons with disabilities in the elaboration of indicators, we will not be able to create useful indicators that can be used by persons with disabilities. So the second principle that has guided our presentation, our indicators paper that we are presenting today, is the fact that we have put it all our efforts to make sure that the voices of persons with disability is fully heard and considered when developing these indicators. And a third important principle that has guided the elaboration of our paper is the fact that these indicators can be easily replicated to measure the progressive realization of other social instruments or international instruments, such as other conventions, the Sustainable Development Goals, or any other related human rights instruments.
One of the key concepts that we've been dealing with is the concept of progressive realization. It's an important United Nations principle and one that maybe not everyone is familiar with, but the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, is very clear in saying that while every country doesn't have to have adhered to every single article of the convention when they ratify it, they do need to be able to show to the committee and to the international community that they are moving in the direction of achieving those goals. So it's the direction to investigate the evolution of disability rights globally. Indicators, and we have evidence-based indicators, were designed to enable us to recognize where the places where the government was moving towards the ideals of disability rights and where they're not. It's therefore very important to be able to ask the right questions to governments, to service organizations, and to programs to make sure that they're actually developing, that they are in fact moving towards the realization of those goals. So our goal in developing this paper, our goal in developing the people's indicators was to develop a set of cross-cutting indicators for each article in the convention based on the voices of people with disabilities. And Jose, you're going to talk a bit about why we call it the people's indicators.
Yes, indeed, Marcia. We have decided to call our paper people's indicators because not only it reflects the voice of persons with disabilities, but because our indicators aim at measuring actually what is happening around persons with disabilities and their full enjoyment or of their human rights. And if we can just summarize some of the critical ideas which has conducted us to arrive to this people indicator, we can list that it is very important to know from the perspective of persons with disability what poverty means, what inequality means, but not just from a theoretical perspective, but also, and I would say the most important piece of our work was because persons with disabilities have told us what poverty meant to them, what discrimination meant to them. So when we were developing our indicators, which we will be looking at in a few minutes, we were very careful in ensuring that the voice of persons with disabilities was heard. And when I say that voice of persons with disability was heard, we were not just looking at quantitative data, but on top, and I would say on top of this, and I would say the most important is that we have understood, or at least we have tried to understand what qualitatively mean poverty by persons with disabilities, what discrimination meant for them, what was clearly an example of discrimination that persons with disability have experienced. And that's why we can say that our indicators are called people indicators, because it helped persons with disabilities in measuring progressive realization of their human rights, but also because it helped persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to work with other marginalized groups. It helped representative organizations of persons with disabilities to get involved and to get engaged with other civil society mechanisms. And the most important, because our indicators will allow persons with disabilities to take a leading role in monitoring their human rights.
We had a team from the north, the global north and the global south. We got together and we worked our way through developing indicators that would reflect those voices of people with disabilities. Our first step was we looked at the concluding observations for all the reports of that the CRPD had done to date, and we looked at the alternative shadow reports. Those were our baseline. The second step was we established clear, well-defined measures to support knowledge of change or progressive realization. Step 3, we extracted relevant data from people with disabilities from DRPI studies. There were over 50 DRPI studies, so we had a rich base of data from those. And finally, we developed a list of indicators for each article of the convention. We saw what was in the concluding reports. We saw the alternative shadow reports. We looked at our own studies for those voices of people with disabilities. And from that, we were able to tease out, we'll talk about some later, some the very most important evidence-based information that would be needed to be able to look at whether progressive realization was happening on the second round of reporting. We have a slide which we're putting up for you now, which is the structure of the paper itself. You received a copy of the people's indicators along with your invitation to this webinar. Here we've just told you what the structure of that paper is so you can understand how we put it together. We hope it's useful and helpful to you when you actually get to that paper and read it. Obviously, we talk about what are indicators, background, context, overview of the report. Then we very clearly outline the methodology we used because we thought it was important for people to have a clear idea of why the relevance of or the methodology that we were using to do this. It is a different methodology than some other people who developed indicators have used, but we think it's an important methodology because of its underlying principles. We look at the DRPI people's indicators then, and we go through indicator by indicator or article by article of the UNCRP, providing those indicators that reflect both the concluding observations, the shadow reports, and the voices of people with disabilities who were engaged in our individual monitoring. Then we have a section where we're talking about or we have a couple of appendices. One is the DRPI indicators. We reproduced them here in the paper as an appendix because we embedded them in the whole of the UNCRPD. In the earlier version, you'll just see the article and you'll see the indicators. And finally, in Appendix B, we were looking at how would this be applied if the UN Committee on CRPD wanted to apply this. How would they do that? Well, they can do that. We have a methodology. We used a couple of countries and the concluding reports to show how in a second go around, in a second report, the kinds of questions they could ask. So there would be very specific questions. The UNCRPD committee would be able to ask those countries so that they would understand the information that the CRPD needed to be able to measure that vital progressive realization. Jose, you were going to talk about some of the characteristics of the indicators?
Sure, yes. We can certainly have a very long list of characteristics of our people's indicators. However, I would just briefly list the most important ones. We can say that we have at least 5 very important characteristics that clearly establish that the people's indicator we are presenting today, it's meant to be used by persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to actually improve the life conditions of persons with disabilities. Our people's indicators can be used locally and globally. What does it mean? That our indicators can measure the progressive realization of a very local policy around persons with disabilities, but can also measure the implementation, an effective implementation of, for instance, the CRPD Convention or the SDGs. Another characteristic, and once again, it's because we believe that indicators have to be available for any person who wants to monitor their human rights, is the fact that our indicators are very easy to use. Persons with disabilities, small organizations, big umbrella organizations can all use our indicators to measure and to monitor their rights. Another important characteristic of our people's indicators is the fact that although they were created based on the UNCRPD Convention, can be easily adapted and can be easily replicated to measure the implementation of other human rights treaty bodies and other big conventions and treaties or any other social instrument such as the SDGs. The last 2 important characteristics that I want to mention are the fact that our indicators can measure the based or the evidence-based human rights actions. It means that our indicators measure states' actions, but also can measure the implementation of human rights that people with disabilities are on a daily basis living with. Finally, our people's indicators have the characteristic to help organizations to measure the realization and the full enjoyment of human rights by persons with disabilities. These 5 characteristics, with many others, help us to summarize that our people indicators are created to be used by us, persons with disabilities, to ensure that our rights are fully respected.
And we're very careful in doing this to take into account the intersection of disability with experiences of other statuses. So we're very careful to recognize that there is a big impact of dual or multiple statuses on poverty, exclusion, and undermining of disability. So we're very cognizant of the fact that there are women with disabilities, that there are Indigenous people with disabilities throughout the world, that there are people from different races and cultures who also have disabilities. And we take that into account in we took that into account in developing the characteristics of the indicators. What do our indicators really provide from your perspective, eh?
Well, once again, we could have a very long list of contributions that our indicators can make, but I will try to list what we have found throughout the process are the most important contributions that our people's indicator can make. First of all, our indicators can let us know the social attitudes towards persons with disabilities. It means that our indicators can help our organizations and persons with disability worldwide to measure how the societies see persons with disabilities and what the social attitudes are about persons with disabilities. Another important contribution that our People's Indicator paper has made is the fact that it helps in a very significant way to persons with disabilities to not only monitor their rights, but also to support their advocacy efforts. I would say that it's definitely a breaking point, this set of indicators, in terms of supporting the excellent work that many persons with disability globally with their organizations are doing in order to monitor their rights and to improve the quality and the impact of their advocacy efforts. Another important contribution is the fact that throughout the implementation of these indicators, we can measure the actions that governments are taking to ensure the full implementation of international conventions. And here it's important to clarify that we are not aiming at judging the role of governments, but rather helping them to find the best way to implement their laws and policies. So this contribution is clearly one of the most important in terms of not just advocating for our rights, but also to work with our governments to work together. Finally, I would say that these indicators contribute to the role that our organizations are doing in terms of ensuring that what has been achieved over the last 10 years at the international level effectively change the life of persons with disabilities at the local level.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jose. We're going to now give a couple of examples of some of the indicators that are in the paper. We're going to give 3 examples, actually. One is Article 5, one is Article 20, and one is Article 27. These just give you a flavor of the types of indicators, people's indicators, that we have come up with for the UNCRPD. In each case, we have provided a quote from somebody, from a person with a disability who was part of our own work at DRPI. Let's look at the equality and non-discrimination. It may be that if you have your paper, you might want to flip to that section. You'll see we've only picked out three of the three of the indicators here for equality and non-discrimination, but we wanted to give you a flavor. So under equality and non-discrimination, what we would be asking governments and what we would expect that the CRPD committee would be asking would be, what is there evidence, is there actual evidence of a general law and public policy guaranteeing equality and reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities? So it's not just, is there a law which is on the books, but rather is there a law that's actually providing for those specific principles to be met? A second indicator is the number and percent of complaints filed per year relating to the discrimination of persons with disabilities. It's clear that if there are no complaints under a general law or public policy guaranteeing equality, you can be sure that the job of that committee or commission is not being carried out. The third is evidence of a complaint mechanism in place for equality and non-discrimination provision, and who bears the burden of proof in those cases. Is it the person with the disability themselves, or is it the agency that bears that burden of proof? This is very important and much more concrete than simply having a general statement about, yes, we have a law or policy. Each of these indicators can be turned into, and you'll see this in the report, in a question that can be asked to a government related to the concluding comments that had come in an earlier report from the CRPD committee. And in the report, you can look at the section following the indicators, and you can see how it's possible to use this. Are you going to talk about personal mobility, Jose?
Yes, thank you, Marcia. As Professor Wilkes has explained to us, we have identified indicators for all of the UNCRPD conventions articles, but we have selected these three articles mainly because it helps us to show you the difference between creating indicators that only request very specific and general information, and those indicators which actually aims at measuring the quality of the services, for example, that persons with disabilities are receiving in many countries around the world. And if we look at the Article 20, personal mobility, we will see that it's a clear example of what we have been talking throughout this webinar so far. Because if we look at the indicator that is on this slide that is being shown here, we will see that when we ask for policies and programs in place to basically monitor how people access, how persons with disability access to, for example, assistive technologies or mobility aids, and what they have to do for obtaining those aids and to renew those assistive technologies, for instance, we will not just measuring whether or not the government is providing persons with disabilities with these tools, but how the process is to obtain those resources. And if we look at the quote that is on the slide, we will see that the person here clearly says that he got the assistive technology required, but it took a lot of time, and this person had to go through an enormous bureaucracy to actually enjoy the right of personal mobility. So with this example, we clearly recognize, or we can clearly conclude that through the people's indicators, we are not just measuring how much we get, what we get, but how we do it according to the UNCRPD standards.
And listen to the voice of somebody who was looking for work, and you'll understand how clear it became to us what we needed to look at in people's indicators. This is on your screen. It was truly disappointing for me to realize that I had passed all of the tests of the application, but when I had to attend the interview, I requested a sign language interpreter, mentioning that I am deaf, and they only replied that that I should look forward to their call. I am still waiting for that call, and it's been 3 years. So what did that lead us? What did that tell us about the kinds of evidence we need to understand whether we could come up with indicators related to work and employment? Well, we have some here. If you look in the report, you'll see there are many more indicators. We've just given you a couple here to give a flavor of the indicators we developed from looking at the reports of the CRPD, the concluding reports, and the shadow reports, and looking at our own interviews with people in their own communities. So one thing we'd want to know is there evidence of anti-discrimination legislation requiring employers to find reasonable accommodation to employees with disabilities? That means when they're entering the labor market, when they're in the labor market, and when they're leaving the labor market. It does not mean that it's all right for somebody to wait for a call for 3 years because a potential employer doesn't want to hire someone who's deaf. It requires evidence of anti-discrimination law prohibiting discrimination of persons with disabilities in the labor market. So again, we're looking for some very concrete data that shows what the government is doing. And have they moved forward from the first report to the second report, which they have to present to the UNCRPD committee? And finally, we said, and this again I point out, these are only 3 of the many indicators which you'll find listed in the report that you have. Is there evidence of a complaint mechanism relating to discrimination at the workplace and enforcement measures in place related to employment? How does somebody who is discriminated against in the workplace or in a job, how are they able to make sure that that is recorded and addressed in some ways? Another person said to us, I've had a whole heap of problems at work, and I still have them today, starting from discrimination as an individual with a disability, whom they basically look on as some form of lower species. They automatically take that type of attitude towards you, regardless of what you know, what you're worth, and what you can do. That's an important quote because it reflects something that we've been talking about for a long time, which is that it's not just whether someone has a job or not. It's whether they have a job with dignity, a job with respect, and a job with autonomy. Clearly, this person has a job. So ticking the box of whether that person has a job is not the same thing of understanding whether it's a job with dignity.
Marcia, I would like to share with our audience what we have learned throughout this entire process, and some final thoughts and if I can call recommendations. I would rather prefer to call lessons we learned when we were developing this set of indicators. A useful indicator is the one that can be used by a person with disability. If we don't understand the importance of empowering persons with disabilities and their representative organizations in monitoring their rights, all the excellent international efforts many leaders have done throughout the years will not reflect into a better life conditions for persons with disabilities. The second lesson learned is that we have to assure that when we talk about rights, we have to include what Marcia just have said around very important human rights principle. The example that Marcia has given us just now, it's clearly what we meant when we developed these indicators. A job without dignity, a job without autonomy, a job without respect for difference is not in the end a job for persons with disabilities. Another important lesson that we learned is that these indicators will allow persons with disabilities and their representative organizations to monitor progressive realization. It's very important now to step forward, not only just monitoring at one specific point, at one specific time, but rather trying to measure what has been done throughout a certain period. And in line with what the CRPD committee has recently recommended under the simplified reporting procedure, this set of indicators will definitely contribute to persons with disabilities and their organizations to monitor in one period of time what has been achieved and what has not been achieved in terms of human rights implementation. Finally, one of the most important recommendations that we can make from here is that these indicators were meant to be developed to monitor the CRPD convention. However, we now need to take these indicators and apply them not only to other UN treaty bodies, such as the CRC or the Convention on the Rights of the Woman, etc., but also try to implement them in what many international organizations and a big number of governments are working in, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the most ambitious agenda, but at the same time, it remains the biggest challenge for us, persons with disabilities and organizations, to fully ensure that our voice is heard in the implementation of the Agenda 2030.
Thanks, Jose. We have a few minutes for questions now, and we will welcome those questions. You can send the questions to drpi.questions@gmail.com, or you can ask the questions directly into the
GoToWebinar platform. You will find a chat box where you can actually type your question.
Yeah. So either way, you can either send us by email. We're monitoring the email right as we sit here, or you can go into the chat box. We're anxious to have your participation and to know your sense of whether we're moving in the right direction. Sure. Oh, would you like to turn your video on?
Yes.
Thanks, Jose. So that people can see us while they ask questions. Oh my goodness, there are quite a few questions I can see.
So the first question is, how long does it take to develop the indicators?
Oh, what a good question. It took us, and I'll also let Jose answer that. It took us, I think, about a year and a half to develop the indicators. We were a team of people from both the North and the South, from 5 continents, who developed them. So it took some time to make sure that they were concrete and solid. Jose, do you want to address that as well?
Just to clarify that it took us a year and a half because we read more than 50 reports which were developed by a project, Disability Rights Promotion International. And we have also spent a significant amount of time reading the concluding observation of the countries we were using as a case studies. And because we also decided to spend a lot of time basically reading and getting to know the voice of persons with disabilities at the grassroots.
But now that they're developed, there isn't a need now to redevelop those indicators. We can move forward and adapt those indicators to some of the other areas we've talked about, CEDA, for example, other international instruments, CEDA, SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, Convention on the Rights of the Child. So these could all be adapted to be able to move forward in using them.
So the second question is, are there any cross-cutting indicators for multiple articles, or are they specific to each article?
They are specific to each article. However, I am quite sure that when they're used, it would be possible to look at cross-cutting indicators, but they were developed because of the request made to us from the committee. They were developed as indicators for each of the articles in the convention.
How can these indicators be used on a government level?
Jose, do you want to answer that?
Yes, I mean, these indicators can be used by anyone, actually. I mean, our indicators are not just for disabled people organizations or just or only by governments. They are rather developed to be used by anyone who is willing to monitor the rights of persons with disabilities based on a evidence-based approach and making sure that the whole process is totally participatory and basically from a very holistic perspective. So all governments are actually very welcome to take our indicators and with the support of disabled people organizations, monitor the rights of persons with disabilities.
I think importantly, if you look also in the report, you'll see there is a section in which we actually look at using the report based on a country concluding comments. So it gives you an actual example of how you adapt them into questions that can be used by government or into questions that can be used by the CRPD committee.
Can these indicators be used at a regional level, or are they only for the national level?
Jose, what's your response to that?
Yeah, no. Once again, I mean, when we were describing the characteristics of our indicators, we said that they can either be used nationally or at the international level, and of course at the regional level. These indicators aim at measuring what can be done in terms of human rights. So we have developed indicators flexible enough to be used both national, internationally, and of course at the regional level.
They are standards, so that because they're standards, really they can be used at just about anywhere where it's useful. You could even use them within a small organization. a service providing organization, for example.
How did you go about using the voices of people with disabilities to develop these indicators?
Over to you, Jose.
Well, it is important to share with you all that this paper that we are presenting today is the result of a project that had 15 years of experience in supporting disabled people organizations to monitor the rights of persons with disabilities. So when we describe, or when we mentioned that we have read 50 reports from different countries around the world, we meant that DRPI, Disability Promotion International, was a monitoring project that allowed us, through a certain number of different tools, to actually listen to the voice of persons with disabilities. And actually, the way that DRPI has developed this monitoring tool is by interviewing persons with disabilities according to specific scientific standards, to make sure that the voice of persons with disability is heard and was considered by Disability Promotion International Project. And then those voices were compiled in reports, and those reports were the one that we use as a baseline to consolidate the set of indicators that we are presenting today.
I think the important part there is we use and we recognize the idea that is in all the UN international instruments about progressive realization. We are moving from point A to point B if we understand that the outcome is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, or are the Social Development Goals, or are the CEDA goals for women's rights, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In all those cases, what we're trying to do is move from a place where people's rights are not totally respected towards a place where people's rights are respected. And to do that, we have to think about the possibility for governments to move, maybe not as rapidly as we would like within our own movement, but move towards those goals, to recognize those goals of having legitimacy. And each country who ratified the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, or any other international conventions, or is participating in the Sustainable Development Goals, has in effect said that they believe in those as outcomes. So the indicators provide a way for governments to self-evaluate, for the committee of the CRPD to evaluate, and for others to evaluate the way in which people are moving forward. That's why we think of them as standards. The people's indicators are standards which take into account not only structural changes that need to be made, but also how it is that people interpret those standards in their own communities, in their own homes, in their own job place. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Jose?
No, Marcia. It's all right.
I realize that we're running out of time and we started a few minutes late, so we should probably conclude now. We'd certainly welcome anybody who wants to ask more questions, or anybody who wants to engage with us in terms of making this happen. We'd be putting this in place. We'd be happy to do that. We want to really thank you very much for participating. We will be putting the indicators webinar up on the website if you want to access it, so that you can see, so that you can reread it if you'd like. Also, we'd like to let you know that we will be pleased to respond to invitations for further discussion of the indicators, either on other webinars or any other manner that you'd like to. We have people on all of the continents who are able to have these discussions. So we very much are interested in discussing that if you want to. I just want to say, you know, there are other standards for measuring and other indicators. But what is unique about our standards, the people standards, is that they reflect the perspective of people with disabilities. They give us the content of the work rather than just the framework or the outline. At the beginning, I said the people's indicators have achieved two goals. One is they provide a concrete way to evaluate progressive realization. Are we moving towards our goals? Are governments moving towards our goals? Are service organizations moving towards our goal? Are regional governments moving towards goals? The second is to provide a way to develop concrete questions for the committee and those writing shadow reports. Questions to ask governments, service providers, and others. It provides us a way to have greater accountability than we've been able to have without the indicators, and greater accountability that comes from the understanding and the perspective of people with disabilities themselves. It really is the time when we need to move beyond the usual type of standards and move beyond the usual type of monitoring and think about how do we really incorporate the views of those who are most impacted. Thanks again for being part of our work. We really appreciate it. I know many of you have written to us before and have talked to us about this, and we really appreciate that. And for your ongoing efforts to enable people with disabilities to be included in recognizing and working on progressive realization of the goals of the CRPD and other international instruments. We have a long way to go. We're nowhere near where we want to get yet, but together we can make a difference. Thanks so much, and thanks, Jose.
Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, everyone.